Every day, the world moves on as it always has. Cities wake up, work begins, and life feels familiar. But beneath that sense of normality, something is shifting. The climate is changing, and the systems we rely on, energy, food, water, cities, finance, are under pressure in ways we're only beginning to understand. These changes don't live in reports or projections, they are already shaping people, livelihoods, and communities. We created the Climate Leadership Podcast so these challenges don't remain abstract or distant, but are explored through the people working inside these systems, making real decisions with real consequences, often without clear answers. This is not a space for fear, blame, or perfection. It's a space for honest conversations about what leadership looks like in a changing world. If you're listening, you're already part of that leadership. Let's begin the conversation.
Welcome to the Climate Leadership Podcast, where we explore how climate and sustainability strategies play out in the real world of business and industry. Today's episode focuses on a topic that features heavily in sustainability roadmaps, annual reports, and policy discussions, yet it remains widely misunderstood: the circular economy in the chemical industry. Circularity is often positioned as a silver bullet, but for an industry that is highly complex, capital intensive, and safety critical, the reality is far more nuanced. What generally works today? What is still more ambition than reality? And where should companies focus next? These are some of the burning questions of the day. To unpack this, I'm joined by Mr. Tony Heslop, a sustainability leader with over 30 years of experience in the chemical industry. Currently, he is working as an independent consultant with CSEP, Center for Sectoral Economic Performance at Imperial College London, on the development of a sectoral roadmap to deliver growth in the fine chemicals sector. Previously, Tony has worked across technical, commercial, and strategic roles and was leading a regional sustainability community across EMEA. His perspective bridge innovation, policy, and commercial execution, and I am delighted to have him today on my show. Thank you, Tony, for joining us today.
Thank you, and I hope your audience enjoy the discussion.
Perfect. So let's get started. So I will start with the circular economy has become a central sustainability theme in chemicals. How well is it truly understood within the industry today?
I mean, that's a really big question, and I think we really need to start thinking about what we as a society understand as circularity and what we understand as materials and chemicals. I think it's fair to say that people in society don't understand where stuff comes from. And certainly the impact of chemicals on their lives. We think about maybe circularity being bottles being recycled into new bottles, or maybe mattresses being recycled into new mattresses, but it goes way beyond that. Chemicals, there's this sort of metric that's been kicking around for a few years now, that 95% of all manufactured goods, everything that we use, is somehow reliant upon chemicals in their process. Which is quite the statistic. And when we start thinking about chemicals in that kind of scenario, really we're talking about petrochemicals. And ultimately, a lot of the stuff that we use is coming from oil, from the oil and gas industry, as well as extracting oil and gas to heat our homes and to power our cars and aeroplanes and everything else in transportation. That industry also provides the feedstock for chemicals. It provides the carbon. And that's where really circularity in the chemical industry comes into play. It's not just about kind of taking those bottles and recycling them back into new bottles, or taking, like I said, mattresses and back into mattresses. It is about circularity of carbon and where we get future feedstocks from. The way that most of the major chemical companies, including my old employers, BASF, think about this is in a number of different circles. So obviously there are things that we can do as consumers to reduce and reuse the materials and the products that we have. But then at end of life, and there will come a point where things become waste and that we have no longer any value upon them, they've got to be reused in the future. There's a scenario kind of playing out where as fuels start to decline and we move to electric vehicles, for example.
Mhm.
And also, we started to decarbonize our energy, which is going really well, and we're using lots of renewables.
Yes.
Then the extraction of sort of oil and gas will start to decline, and that will have an impact on the availability of feedstocks for the chemical industry. So we need to think about where we get carbon from, and this is where that sort of circularity of carbon comes into the piece. So again, one of those kind of circular loops is recycling. But then
Mhm.
there are more advanced technologies of looking at things like depolymerization or treating materials in certain ways to get them back to feedstocks that we can
Mhm.
use within the chemical industry.
Right.
Then we have another kind of loop that we can create around carbon dioxide itself. So obviously carbon
Mhm.
dioxide, we burn carbon, it gets into the atmosphere, creates greenhouse gases, and we know the consequence of that in terms of climate change. We can capture that carbon at source, and we can
Mhm.
process that back into something to make chemicals out of, or we could use nature to do that process for us, where plants capture CO2 from the atmosphere, convert it to biomass, and we can use that biomass as a source feedstock for chemicals. So you can see that it gets very complicated very quickly.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think, the end game somewhere down the line, 50 or 100 years, is we're going to stop extracting and using fossil-based feedstocks, because ultimately they end up in the atmosphere in some way, shape, or form, whether we burn them or whether we use them as materials.
Right.
And when that time comes, we have to have these circular solutions to utilize the materials that we already have
Mhm.
in the system to create future feedstocks when they become waste.
Right. So during the conversation, you were saying a lot about feedstock. So
Yeah.
can you please define for me what does that mean?
I mean, for the chemicals industry, certainly for BASF and most of the major petrochemicals manufacturers in Europe, 50% of our products are produced through a starting point, which is the steam cracking of naphtha.
Okay.
So that naphtha is the bit of oil and gas processing that isn't used in the production of fuels. So they found this sort of side stream that then goes off to the chemical industry. It's a soup of materials. We use energy to break that into different streams, and then we reassemble that into molecules to make the materials that we use.
Okay.
So a lot of our problems could be resolved by finding alternative sources of naphtha type materials, or
Mhm.
creating new molecules further downstream that are sort of homologs to the ones that we currently make from fossil-based materials. So that's
Mhm.
kind of what I mean by feedstocks. It's at the moment we're using fossil-based materials. Consequence of that is that the processing of those fossil-based materials upstream before it even gets to the chemical industry is about 3 times as much in terms of emissions. And then
Mhm.
downstream, obviously, if you're putting material into consumers' hands and then it becomes waste, it's going to end up in the environment or incinerated, and that's fossil carbon that will go into the atmosphere as well. So ultimately, again, for many different reasons, for emissions reasons, we'd want to get or to transition away from those fossil-based materials to lower our
Mhm.
carbon footprints and to achieve
Okay.
net zero, to be fair.
Right. 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 And also, I was thinking, Tony, that circular economy is a very loosely used term today, even on LinkedIn. Everyone
Yeah.
is posting about it. So, where do you think people don't fully understand that concept of circular economy?
Um, again, I think it does come back to what people think is circular economy. Is it bottle to bottle?
Mhm.
I've got a slide deck that I can't show in this context, but it's is it taking a Coke bottle and making it back into a Coke bottle? Yeah, well, yes, obviously it is. That's circular economy. That's recycling.
Mhm.
Is it taking that PET and spinning it as a fiber and making a fleece out of it?
Right.
Yeah, that probably is circular economy. It's just not that circle that people think of. Or is it taking that material and stripping it back to its molecules and making something completely different?
Mhm.
Um, you know,
Right.
there's a lot of different solutions out there,
Okay.
and the full extent of circular economy. I always bring it back to the carbon molecules, the CO2, and everything that we can make from that.
Mhm.
It doesn't just have to be bottle to bottle, because there is a point where that doesn't work anymore, where you've recycled it to a point of degradation. You have to find other solutions for that.
Right.
So yeah, for me, it's all to play for in the next sort of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years.
Okay.
I feel that the solutions are out there and they often need to scale. And I think
Mhm.
we'll probably touch on that later in this conversation.
Sure, sure. So, mechanical and chemical recycling are often debated as competing solutions.
Yep.
Where does each work best in practice?
Okay. I mean, both are complicated. So when we're talking specifically here about techniques to recycle plastics, basically. Mechanical recycling, you take a plastic bottle, you melt it down, and you mold it back into something else, maybe another plastic bottle. There are degrees of success within that, and there are challenges as well. So we know that recycling could be better. Percentage rates in the UK, I think for something like PETs, around about 65%. So you'd say that that's relatively successful. But for other polymers, it isn't. And as consumers, we put some of our plastics into recycling. Some people don't, obviously, but most people, if you ask them in the street, would claim to do that. But effectively, when that arrives at a recycler's, it's a mix of 7 or 8 different polymers that they have to then sort out. And what you need to do to recycle a bottle is you need to have a clean stream of PET, which is what the bottle is made out of. So that is then a problem for the recycling companies to sort and separate all of those different polymers out into a clean stream. So that's one of the challenges of mechanical recycling, but they do a really good job, and technology is moving on through things like AI sorting and these kind of things to identify the plastics, to separate them into their streams and to recycle them. And that will only drive up sort of recycling rates. So it's a really good way of doing things. It's quite well established. It's probably the best way of dealing with a lot of plastics products up to a certain point, but there are things that it can't do. And that's where something like chemical recycling comes in. So chemical recycling broadly is an umbrella term for a collection of different technologies where you're breaking down the plastic into its original components, monomers or smaller molecules, and then you can reassemble them, you can repolymerize them, or you can put them through a process like steam cracking and create chemicals or materials from them. It usually involves a bit of energy to do that. So it's kind of like not melting but not burning. It's somewhere in between. It's pyrolysis, or like I say, a basket of different technologies. It could be depolymerization, it could be solvolysis, for example, but getting back to those original molecules. It works well with the other stuff, or it should work well with the other stuff that standard mechanical recycling cannot deal with. So, when we started looking at this seriously, I mean, it's a technology that's probably been around for 30 or 40 years, maybe even longer. I mean, certainly I saw references within BASF that we've been looking at this in the 90s. So that gives you kind of an idea of how old the technology is, but never really got going until, you got things like the Blue Planet and this focus on plastics waste and how we deal with that. So the chemical recycling really fits into a space where mechanical recycling can't work, or it doesn't really work. So I'm thinking of things like black plastics, although there have been major technological movements forward in the selection and separation and processing of black plastics. But in general, the IR sensors in a recycling plant can't see black plastics, they can't determine them, so therefore they can't sort them. The other big area is films. So if you think of a bottle is not a film, but you know what a film is, a plastic bag type thing, something that's flexible. Often in many applications, they're multiple layers, so they're not just one polymer. And like I said, you need to have clean streams of polymers to mechanically recycle them. Therefore, it's economically unviable to separate all the different layers out, because they're microns thin, and you need a way of dealing with that, of getting it back to the carbon to process it. Again, another thing is like when you mechanically recycle materials, ultimately they're going to degrade to a point where they're probably not going to work. The chains get shorter and shorter through time and temperature and processing, and at some point they're degraded to a point where they're going to have to go through another process. And this is where chemical recycling sort of fits. It's those bits that mechanical recycling can't do. But you've got to accept that it's going to be slightly higher energy and slightly higher emissions. But it's not that chemical recycling is a silver bullet to replace everything else. It fits in its space, and for us in the chemical industry, it provides a feedstock. So if our game is to gradually replace the amount of fossil-based materials that we use, and we have this naphtha-like material, or this feedstock-like material that we can plug in at the start, then that's got to be good.
Yes.
So yeah, it's horses for courses, I think, and making everything work.
Okay, perfect. So many circular technologies perform well in the pilot scale,
Yeah.
but what are the biggest barriers when trying to scale them industrially?
I mean, I think there are probably two areas, and the first one's probably not insurmountable. It's going to be that technical engineering challenge. So when you go from, making a few hundred mils to making a kilo to making tens of kilos, and then to making hundreds or thousands of kilos, every step along the way is going to be a technological challenge, and that's just engineering. And I think it's not insurmountable.
Mhm.
We've seen things scale before it can be done. Is what I'm saying. Um, Probably what concerns me more are the economics of stuff. And it's that kind of valley of death, the fabled valley of death that companies have. You get up to a pilot scale where you're doing tens, hundreds of tons. You want to get to thousands of tons. And it's that bit in the middle where you're going to have to invest in some serious kit. You're talking hundreds of thousands or millions of pounds. But at the same time, you haven't got a market, you haven't got a revenue stream, so you're going to be short on cash. And that's the bit where it needs either some sort of access to capital from maybe government subsidies, or funding from other places. And that can be very difficult for companies to get that. When we're looking at investors, if you're coming up with sort of shiny AI solutions, that seems to be where all of the money is going at the minute. Whereas something like circular economy, recycling of plastics, it's not the sexiest topic in the world, and it can be quite difficult. You overlay kind of policy and things onto that, where policy changes and where there's inconsistency in policy, that can make or break also whether markets proceed or die.
Right.
Because if government changes things halfway down the line, or drafts policy that doesn't quite work, then we can see consequence and knock-on effects of that. So they're probably the biggest challenges that lots of companies face. Access to money, basically,
Access to
to achieve scale. Yeah.
Right. So, Tony, I was thinking in the UK,
Yeah.
these plastic recycling companies, are these private companies, or do we have public sector players as well?
It's mostly private companies, mostly big companies. To be fair,
Mhm.
there's a small number of very big operators who will collect, sort, and process material and then sell it onto the market. Yeah,
Mhm.
so it generally tends to be the bigger end. It's big pieces of kit, it's big facilities. I can't think of any that would be publicly owned.
Mhm.
Maybe
Okay.
maybe there's a call for privatization somewhere down the line. I don't know. That's beyond my pay scale. But yeah, it tends to be fairly big organizations, fairly big international organizations as well,
Okay.
involved in that. Yeah.
I see. I see. So, feedstock quality and availability are frequently cited challenges. How
Yeah.
critical is this issue, and how can it be addressed?
Well, I mean, there's two sort of angles that I would come at that question. I think there's a feedstock for recycling, and then there's the feedstock for the chemical industry, and the two are kind of the two ends of that processing chain in the middle. In terms of for recycling, whether it's mechanical or chemical, there needs to be a degree of separation and sorting. And as I addressed earlier, that can be quite difficult because as consumers, we recycle some stuff, we don't recycle other bits. As it's received by recyclers at the minute, you will get a bucket of mixed polymers, and it's up to them to then deal with that, to sort it and process it in a way to get to the purest possible material that they can get, and then recycle it from that. Things should improve. I mean, the government has put into place simpler recycling, which comes along the line in 2027, I think it is, and they will start to collect things like flexibles, things like plastic bags. So at the minute, if you want to recycle anything flexible, any flexible film, basically you've got to take it to the supermarket, and they have these things where you put. I mean, how many people do that in reality? Some people do, but I would say probably 99% of people probably that I don't do it. I don't take my waste flexible plastics to Aldi and put it in a bin there. But that should start at curbside, so it will start as a collection in 2027. Now, if you consider that chemical recycling needs that flexible material, and that flexible material needs chemical recycling, then you can join the dots between the two. So that should make things a little bit easier in terms of what is collected as plastics. If we're told you could put all of your plastics into this bin as a consumer, that's an easy thing. Because at the minute, we're going, well, do I recycle this? Don't I recycle this? If I put the wrong thing in the bin, am I contaminating it? And. So that's sort of the sort of feedstock end from a recycling point of view. From a chemical producer point of view, then we have quite tight standards in terms of what we need to receive from the industry. So we've got to be quite clear about the specifications of the feedstocks that we need in terms of purity, in terms of the sort of distribution of molecules, for example. Because putting materials into our existing assets could destroy them. And when you're talking about assets that cost billions of euros, then that's the last thing you want to do. And it does sound a bit risk averse, but we've got to make sure that we work with supply chain partners to ensure that we get the right quality of materials and that they develop their processes accordingly.
Okay, perfect. So virgin materials are often cheaper than circular alternatives.
Yeah.
How should companies think about the economics of circular investments today?
It's the $1 million question. It really is. And the context of this is kind of thinking about where materials come from, and if we say they all come from the oil and gas industry, and how long that's been established, and how efficient it's become. I mean, the rise of sort of plastic materials and petrochemicals is the sort of 40s, 50s, post-war into the 60s and 70s. So you had 60 or 70 years to create the systems and create the efficiencies, starting from a material that is going to be consistent and cheap through those efficient systems to create the products that we know and love at a price point that we are all able to access them. And the benefits to society of that has been everything that's around us. Like 95% of all materials that we use are somehow involved with chemicals. You see the way that lifetimes have evolved and the comfort in our lives. So there's massive benefits there. So I'm not going to decry the petrochemical industry. But coming back to the sort of question about the economics of it, how do then the new technologies compete with that? Because they're always going to be more expensive. If you're taking biomass and converting it into something and you've not achieved scale, how do you compete with something that is that ruthlessly efficient? And it's really, really difficult. And that's kind of where a lot of companies fail is not to have the business model in place. I think there's a lot to be done in terms of policy, of legislation, of regulation, of how we deal with that, and a lot that governments can do. Because if it's just a straight shootout between, at a consumer level of product A versus product B, one is fossil, one is non-fossil, and this one's 50% more expensive, 75-80% of people are going to go for that one. They're going to. There is a certain section. There are segments in society who will pay more for recycled materials, and in the initial part of the scale up, that's great. But ultimately down the line, it's probably going to be some of the government sticks, probably more than carrots, that determine how that sort of develops. The way that BASF's approaching it, my former employers, is they're waiting for the point that the willingness to pay of their customers is in place. And that's largely not being driven by us as consumers saying, okay, we now want to pay for these recycled or repurposed or whatever products. It's actually the drive that's coming from within industry and from within government to create the systems and the policy frameworks that drive the transition towards green, or however you want to describe that product in the future. Yeah.
Right, Tony. So the same kind of argument are usually, I heard these arguments when it comes to organic food, because sometimes they are costlier than the non-organic one, and then the purchasing power comes into picture.
I mean, there is another way of looking at this that I've not touched upon, and that's the true full cost of using fossil-based materials. The impact of a fossil-based material in terms of, it gets into the environment, it creates a greenhouse gas, that creates climate change, and that has an impact.
Yeah.
We don't cost that impact into the initial price of the material that we're using. So if you think about an environmental, I mean, the example that I have been used is the floods that were in Spain 2 or 3 years ago. And I think about 200 people died in that. So there's the cost of human life, but there's also the cost of repairing everything. Who paid for that cost?
Yes.
It was the people of Spain through taxation.
Yes.
If we have worsening health outcomes because of climate change, who pays for that? We all pay for it through general taxation, but we don't link it back to the initial source material. So again, there's this kind of disparity of an unlevel playing field between new technologies and old technologies, shall we say.
Yeah, I really like that point. So in the current system, I think we should include the environmental damage tax kind of a thing. Then the price will increase, right? The price will increase.
I mean, to a certain extent, that's happening. Whether the schemes such as, I mean, things like extended producer responsibility, where if you're placing something onto the market that is damaging or polluting, then you should pay for its cleanup, and that's factored into the cost. But does it work? Not entirely sure, and it doesn't apply to everything. I mean, I'd argue that maybe a tax at the point of extraction of oil and gas might be the best thing, but I'm probably fighting an uphill battle against some very strong lobbyists in other industries.
Right. So now we come to the customers. Like, how ready are customers to adopt circular or recycled chemical product, especially in a regulated or performance critical applications?
I mean, again, that's probably two different questions. The first one about general consumers. I mean, if you think about diffusion of innovation curves, which I'm sure your audience will understand, there are the innovators, the early adopters, and then you move into kind of mass market adoption. There's always going to be that group who will pay extra to be green. Let's call it that. As things develop, then there is this general shift in society that accepts it, but there's always that cost component. So it can be really, really difficult to sell these things when at some point, probably more than 50% of your consumers just don't care. And again, it comes back to that thing. If I'm going to pay for A and B and B is 50% more expensive, I'm going to buy A because they don't care. I mean, if you speak to a lot of the consumer goods companies, they will say that there's a limited premium that you can put on green products. 10-15% might be able to get away with that. And again, it comes back to that question about who pays for this and how we get people to pay for this transition, because it could be more expensive. Then you start thinking about, well, what about fairness in this? What if we start putting a green premium and people can't afford it?
Yes.
How do we deal with all that? So there's a lot of stuff to unpick within that needs to be thought about very carefully over the next sort of 10, 15, 20 years or however long the transition takes. On critical applications, I mean, wow, that's another can of worms. So things like food contact, things like medical applications, and when you come back to specifically materials and plastics, that is a very difficult area, and one that the industry is actively addressing. So for mechanical recycling, you have to be be sure of very, very pure stream to be able to demonstrate that what you're putting onto the market is suitable for food contact, and it's not beyond the realms of human endeavor to do that. We can do it, and what it probably does need is changes in regulation to be a little bit more flexible to say that you can use recycled materials in this. The other way of doing it is chemical recycling. I mean, chemical recycling strips things back to the molecule and then reassembles it. So any contamination that you have in there is completely taken out, because you're dealing with like for like molecules. So you get it back to something like ethylene. Ethylene, whether it comes from oil or whether it comes from a recycled stream, when you make that back into a polyethylene bottle, it's the same thing. So that's another of looking at that. There's another niche that the chemical recycling could actually fit quite nicely into. Yeah.
Okay. So circular economy requires collaboration across value chains.
Yeah.
What type of industry collaboration have you seen work most effectively?
I think it's fair to say that when we start talking about business to business exchange, in the past, if you were operating a business, you would talk to your direct upstream, so your suppliers, and your direct downstream, your customers, but you'd never go beyond that. And when you're talking about very long value chains, that's what limits the information that you've got. And what is absolutely critical in establishing new value chains is understanding exactly what's happens from start to finish. And even then, start to finish isn't the start to finish, because you ought to loop the finish back to the start, if you see what I mean, to create those circular economies. So it's quite an interesting conversation to be had. That I think is fair to say. I can give you an example. So while I was at BASF for the last 3 years, I was working with a consortium, 17 companies, on a project called Flue to Chem. So this was taking carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas emissions from the paper industry that would normally, disappear out into the atmosphere and cause climate change, and trying to recycle them back into chemicals that we could use to make surfactants, the soapy bit that goes into consumer products, to supply to the formulators, the Unilevers and the Procter and Gambles and the Reckitt and Benkeisers, to make into consumer goods. The reason there were 17 different partners within that is because we had to have the whole supply chain aligned. So we had, you have the paper industry making paper and emitting. You have somebody to capture the carbon and process that, the CO2, to get that to the chemical industry. And then there's like 3 or 4 different stages to make the chemical product before you can then send it to the downstream industries to formulate into the consumer products to make something that is essentially the same. It's really, really difficult. It is really difficult. But through working together, you understand the full implications of going from kind of A to B to C to D to Z and then back to A again. It would only have worked had we had those conversations, had it been to be fair to Innovate UK, who funded it, part of the big task was getting everybody together and building the consortium.
Yes.
Because like I say, normally we wouldn't speak to the paper industry directly about this. And normally we would speak to Unilever because they're our customers, but not necessarily on a project like this and in the depth that we had. So, I see those conversations being replicated in many different aspects of both mechanical and chemical recycling and other circular economy projects, because you have to build these sort of new chains, but you also have to understand the dynamics at every single stage in order to make it work.
Right. Yeah, Tony, I was thinking the same. It's really difficult to collaborate to make everyone agree to the same process. Yeah, that's the challenge.
Absolutely. I mean, when you consider that within that project we had 3 chemical manufacturers, and the chemical industry is a bit strange in that you can simultaneously be a customer, a supplier, and a competitor. And for those 3 companies, for ourselves, Croda and Johnson Matthey, we're all customers of each other, we're all suppliers of each other, we're all competitors as well. And there are things that you can say in the room and things that you can't. How do you separate the different interests?
Right.
Ultimately, what drove that was a desire from everybody on that chain to achieve the same end, which was the reduction of CO2 emissions, and the proof that we could do something like this to make new technology work. As long as you've got that kind of guiding principle and everybody agrees on it, you can work out the kind of the walls between the conversations to separate the really sensitive technical stuff that you don't want to discuss with your competitors. You can work that out. But everything else, as long as we have this common vision and common goal, we can make it work. And that was the great thing about it. Yeah.
Right. The motivation matters at the end. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So finally, with limited capital and multiple sustainability priorities, how should chemical companies decide where to invest in circularity now and over the next decade?
Oh, I mean, that's again, it's way beyond my pay grade, that one. The chemical industry, I mean, certainly in Europe, it's in a very difficult position at the minute because, high energy costs and everybody, I mean, that in itself is a driver to improve things like greenhouse gas emissions and to create greater efficiencies, but it doesn't necessarily drive circular economy if all of your money is being put in one basket in a certain area. Where would I recommend people and how would I recommend that companies deal with this is a really, really difficult question. I'm trying to think of a good answer for it. Again, reflecting back on the way that BASF is kind of approaching this and waiting until companies are willing to pay. Again, external drivers will probably drive this forward, but you have to be in it to win it. I think you have to be starting to think about what the future looks like now in order that when that future does materialize, you have something in place, and that may mean investing a lot in R&D and innovation right now, which I know a lot of companies are, and then over time proving and scaling those, and that's kind of the I guess the name of the game right now. There are a lot of options for creating circularity. There are a lot of different technologies out there, and I think you've got to try and pick the winners, invest in the winners, and when the time comes that they commercialize and scale, you're ready to go for that. That's probably the best answer I can give on that one, because the future is quite uncertain. It really is. We know roughly where we need to be. We know roughly we have a bunch of technologies, but bridging that gap between A and B is not quite clear as yet. And within that, you've got a lot of different moving parts as well, specifically around things like where do we get access money, where do we access technology, and what is the policy and regulatory framework going to look like in the next 10 or 15 years. So, it's all quite fluid at the minute. It will work things out, I'm sure, because we have to get to net zero by 2050 or sometime shortly after that, or suffer the consequences. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Nothing is very clear, but we need to be there when the things change. So I think that's a very good takeaway from this. So thank you, Tony, for joining us today and sharing such practical, honest, and deeply grounded insights. This conversation is a reminder that circular economy leadership in the chemical industry is not only about new technologies or bold targets, it's about making thoughtful choices across materials, infrastructure, economics, and collaboration. For our listeners, mechanical and chemical recycling, policy framework, customer demand, and industry partnership are not just standalone solutions. Together, they form the building blocks of a more circular and resilient chemical value chain, one that moves beyond hype and towards real, scalable impact. Thank you for joining us today. We will be back with more conversations on climate leadership across industries. Until then, take care and have a nice day. Bye-bye.